Continuation of the Hardy Boys and the Missing Chums. Chapter 16, The Alarm. The Hardy Boys were quivering with excitement. They had found the whereabouts of their chums. They had learned the dismaying news that Fenton Hardy had been captured by his enemies, and they had discovered the hiding place of the gang. All this had taken place in a few fleeting hours. Their first problem was to release Chet and Biff. But at first glance that seemed impossible. For when Pete came back into the cave, he flung a bunch of keys into the sand beside the fire and laughed harshly. "They'll get tired of being chained up to a rock after a few more days." "They'll come through yet." "We can wait as long as they can," declared Red. "If they'll only write a letter to their mother now and tell her we want that ransom, and we'll be sitting pretty. Fenton Hardy can't come after them, that's certain." "Well, it's a good day's work. I'm going to sleep," said one of the other men. He pulled a blanket about him and curled up beside the fire. "Good idea," remarked Red. "We might as well all turn in." Shortly afterwards, the various members of the gang were sprawled about in their blankets on the sand. Frank noticed that they all slept on the same side of the fire, and also noted that the reason for this was that on one side of the cave the floor was a ledge of rock. "We'll wait till they go to sleep," he whispered to Joe. His brother nodded. The two boys remained crouched among the rocks. Gradually the fire, untended, died down, and there was only a faint rosy glow through the interior of the cave. 2 or 3 of the men had talked together in low murmurs for a while, but gradually their voices died away, and soon the boys could hear their snores. It was nearly an hour, however, before they were satisfied with all the men that they were asleep. "I'm going in after Chet and Biff," whispered Frank with determination. "I'm with you. The keys are still laying beside the fire." "Good." Frank rose from his cramped position among the rocks. Joe followed his example. Quietly they moved towards the entrance of the cave. The snores of the slumbering men were unbroken. Frank took the lead and tiptoed slowly forward, step by step, keeping a wary eye on the recumbent forms wrapped in the blankets. The boys made their way into the cave. Frank remembered where the keys had been thrown, and now he saw them in the sand. The faint glow of the firelight gleamed on them. The keys were on the side of the fire nearest the men. It would be a delicate job to get possession of them. He bent forward and crawled on hands and knees. Joe came silently behind. Frank skirted the fire, then groped carefully forward. There was a mutter from the shadows. One of the men stirred in his sleep. The boys remained rigidly still. The muttering died away. After a long pause, Frank again reached for the keys. His hands closed over them. He gripped them tightly so that they would not jingle together. Then he moved slowly back onto the rock ledge, the keys safely in his grasp. The Hardy Boys continued their silent journey towards the darkness in the rear of the cave. The dying fire cast little light. Little by little they edged forward into the depths of the cave, past the sleeping men. The slightest noise, they knew, might be sufficient to arouse one of the gang. They proceeded with the utmost caution towards the back of the cavern. At length Frank found what he sought. It was a dark patch in the rear wall, the entrance to the inner chamber. He reached it safely and groped his way through the pitchy blackness beyond. He stopped and listened. The sound of deep breathing told him that his 2 friends were asleep within. He reached back and laid a restraining hand on Joe's arm, indicating that he was to remain at the mouth of the inner chamber and keep watch. Joe realized his intention and remained where he was. Frank then continued. Cautiously he groped about in the darkness, moving slowly forward. At length his hand fell upon an outstretched arm, then a shoulder which stirred slightly. He bent forward and shook the sleeper. "Chet!" he whispered. The other boy moved and began to sit up. The chains jangled. "Quiet!" whispered Frank, fearing that his chum might be alarmed at this sudden and surprising awakening and make some sound. "Who is it?" whispered the other. "It's me, Frank. I've come to help you get free." From the darkness he heard a gasp of surprise, but it was quickly silenced. "I'm awake, Biff," replied Chet. Frank had merely guessed at this being Chet Morton, whom he had awakened, and found that his guess had been correct. In a few minutes Biff had been aroused. "The men are asleep," whispered Frank. "Don't ask questions. Keep quiet until we get outside. I have the keys. Where's the lock?" "We're chained to the rock," Chet whispered in return. He grasped Frank's hand, guiding it to the wall of the cave until his fingers closed on a heavy padlock. "There you are." Frank tried several keys before he found the one that fitted. But at length the padlock snapped open. He grasped the chain with his other hand so that it did not fall to the floor with a clatter. He lowered it gently. "Now for the handcuffs." Chet extended his wrists, and Frank finally located the small key that opened the handcuffs. He removed them, then released Chet's feet in a similar manner, and then he crawled over to Biff, releasing him from his chains. All this work had been done with a minimum of noise, and as there had been no warning whispered from Joe, they assumed that the men in the outer cave had not been aroused. Frank led the way out, the three crawling on hands and knees into the main cave. They could see Joe crawling ahead of them, past the ruby glow of the embers. The snores of the men continued without interruption. Frank was jubilant. The most dangerous part of the affair was over. Could they but gain the entrance in safety and reach their motorboat in the cove before the gang should discover that their prisoners had escaped, all would be well. Frank caught sight of a flashlight laying on the sand. His own light had been lost in the rock cave the previous day, and he knew they would need a light to regain their boat. He reached carefully over for it. His hands closed about the black cylinder, and the light was his. Chet and Biff nodded appreciatively when they saw what he had done. The flashlight would be a big factor in aiding their escape. Joe had reached the entrance to the cave by now. They saw him get to his feet and glide silently out into the darkness. Frank reached the end of the ledge. The flashlight was clutched in his hand. Slowly, he rose to his feet, but a small pebble betrayed him. He lost his balance and staggered for a second. Had it not been for the flashlight, the emergency would have passed because he flung out his hand and supported himself against a wall of the cave. But the heavy flashlight had struck a loose projection of the rock. There was a grinding clatter of stone as the rock came free. In the dead silence of the cave, the noise seemed magnified many times, and Frank knew that the sleepers would be aroused. He threw caution to the wind. He leapt forward, gaining the entrance at a bound. Chet Morton and Biff Hooper, seeing that nothing was to be gained by further caution, scrambled to their feet and raced in pursuit. The noise of the dislodged rock had already awakened one of the men. He raised himself on elbow in alarm and peered about. Then he saw the fleeing figures in the mouth of the cave and heard the running footsteps. He sprang at once to his feet. "They're getting away!" he roared. "Wake up, men! They're getting away!" Instantly, pandemonium prevailed within the cave. The men hastily tumbled out of their blankets, bewildered at being aroused from slumber. The Hardy Boys and their chums, racing across the rocky stretch on the outskirts of the cave, heard the uproar of the cry. "After them! Don't let them escape!" Chapter 17. Capture. The men in the cave lost no time in taking up the pursuit. They had been sleeping in their clothes, and once aroused, hurried out of the cave in search of the fugitives. The boys raced across the rocks behind them, and they could hear shouts as the gangsters called to each other. Then came the crash of a revolver as one of the men pumped shot after shot in their direction. Biff sprawled full length on the rocks. "Are you hurt?" asked Joe, stopping to help him rise. No, I'm all right, gasped Biff, scrambling to his feet. He had suffered bruises, but seemed otherwise uninjured. However, when he began to run again, Joe noticed that he was limping, and his progress was slower than formerly. Frank had the battered flashlight, but he did not dare switch it on for fear of revealing their whereabouts to the men in pursuit. The latter, however, were stumbling along behind, following the trail by reason of the noise the boys made in their mad flight towards the trees. The men had the advantage in that they knew every inch of the rock ground. The boys had to proceed more cautiously because it was unfamiliar to them, especially to Chet and Biff. Biff was limping along in the rear, and Joe purposely slowed down in pace so as to remain with his chum. But the delay was fatal. Out of the darkness came one of their pursuers, and with a growl of triumph he flung himself at Biff. His arms encircled the lad's legs in a perfect tackle, and Biff went down with a crash. Joe wheeled about and plunged upon them, striking out desperately to fight off Biff's attacker. They struggled fiercely in the darkness. Joe felt his fist crash into the man's face, and he heard a grunt of pain. Biff was wriggling out of his assailant's grasp, and the boys might indeed have made their escape, had it not been that the other men came running up out of the shadows. With a roar of fury, two of the men plunged at the boys and hauled them away from their friends. After the other two, shouted a voice, which they recognized as that of Red. They're heading for the bushes. Joe and Biff found themselves roughly hauled to their feet, their arms held tightly behind them. They heard the clatter of footsteps as two of the other men ran after Frank and Chet. Back to the cave with 'em, growled Red. Looks like we've got one of the guys that helped 'em get away. We've been thinking all day that there was somebody hanging around here that we didn't know about. The lads were shoved and pushed ahead of their captors, dragged and bundled across the rocks until they reached the cave. Then they were roughly shoved through the entrance into the light of the fire. Ah, I thought so, declared Red, one of the guys that tried to help them get away. He peered closer at Joe. Blessed if it ain't one of those two boys that was on the boat with the Hardys that day. One of the other men ordered the boys to sit down, and they crouched beside the stirred-up fire, sick at heart, wondering how it fared with Frank and Chet. When Joe and Biff were captured, it was Chet's first impulse to turn and go back, but a warning shout from Frank restrained him. Keep running, he called. If they're caught, we'll have a chance to get help. The wisdom of this course flashed through Chet's mind at once. If they went to the aid of their comrades, they would probably all be captured in a worse position than before. But if two or even one managed to escape, it would be possible to bring help to the island and effect the release of the others. Chet heard Frank crash into the undergrowth. It was pitch darkness, and although he tried to follow, he knew he had left the trail. He did not call out because he was afraid of revealing his whereabouts to the men behind, but he blundered on, hoping to catch up with Frank. As for the latter, he was quite unaware of Chet's predicament. Chet crashed into the bushes. Branches whipped his face, roots gripped his feet. He struggled on through the dense growth, blindly in the darkness. Far ahead of him, he could hear Frank making his way through the underbrush, but when he tried to go towards the sound, he found that his sense of direction was confused. He struggled on for some time. Suddenly, he saw a patch of gray light ahead. It was the open sky, and he plunged out of the undergrowth into a rocky clearing. He breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. A dark figure loomed up before him. He dodged swiftly to one side, but a huge hand caught at his clothing. He was spun violently around, and then he was caught by the collar, despite his struggles. Got you, grunted the dark figure, with satisfaction. Now if we can only get the other. He said no more, but shoved Chet before him across the rocks. Then it was that Chet found that instead of fleeing farther away from the cave, he had really made a circle in the wood and had emerged directly into the clearing ahead. He was sick with disappointment. He wriggled and twisted in the grasp of his captor, but the man was too strong for him, and he shook Chet vigorously, tripping his feet from under him. "None of that! You come along with me," he rasped. And in a few minutes Chet was shoved back into the cave, where he found Biff Hooper and Joe Hardy crouched silently beside the fire with downcast faces. Frank alone had escaped. Frank knew that Chet had got lost, but he did not dare call out, for he could also hear the running tramp of feet that told him their pursuers had not yet given up the chase. If he could only reach the cove and get the motorboat started, he would be able to go over to the mainland for help. If only one escaped, it would be sufficient to save the others. He could not afford to risk his own capture in seeking Chet. He crashed on through the bushes, trying to make as little noise as possible, but he was off the trail, and the tangled undergrowth was growing dense with every forward step he took. He still clutched to the flashlight that had been the cause of their undoing. He was glad he had found it, because in the pitch blackness he was unable to find his way. He could hear the roar of the waves, but they appeared to come from all sides, and he was unable to judge accurately the route to the shore. Frank decided that he would not make use of the flashlight until it was absolutely necessary. There was too much danger that its gleam might be seen by one of the searchers, and he knew that the gang would not give up the chase as long as they knew he was on the island. "Perhaps they don't know there are two of us," he thought. "If Joe can convince them that he rescued Chet and Biff single-handedly, they won't know about me, and they won't keep on searching." In this lay his only hope, in this and the chance that he would be able to reach the motorboat and make his escape, and without being seen. But if the gangsters knew he was still free, they would leave no stone unturned to find him, as they would know that if he once left the island they were lost. He blundered about in the deep thicket, turning vainly this way and that. Great vines trailed across his face. He brushed aside stubborn branches and soggy wet leaves. He stumbled over roots and little brushes, the deep grass rustling and hissing at his feet. There was no other way. He would have to use the flashlight. The darkness was impenetrable. Trees and bushes encircled him. He could not see where he was going. He switched on the light, and to one side of him was a short passage among the bushes, so he headed in that direction. He managed to get free of the worst of the vines and the thick foliage and found himself in a forest. He went down it in the direction of a booming surf. His heart beat quickly at the thought that he was now free and that he would soon be back at the boat. What had happened to Chet? He judged that his chum was either captured now or lost in the grove. Frank knew that he could not wait to learn Chet's fate, because any delay would be fatal to them all. He had switched on the flashlight and was plunging along through the darkness when the forest aisle suddenly took a twist, and he found himself again floundering in the midst of trees and trailing vines and entangled. Frank switched on the flashlight again, and a second later he heard a grim voice from close by. "Throw up your hands." He wheeled about and found himself suddenly bathed in a ring of light. Someone was standing only a few feet away with a flashlight leveled at him, and in the beam of the flashlight he could see a glittering revolver aimed directly towards him. "Throw up your hands," rasped the voice again, "or there'll be a shot." Slowly Frank raised his hands above his head. "That's better. Now march back again. Back to the cave, young fellow. We've got you now. Forward march." Chapter 18. Back to the cave. "This is a piece of luck," declared the red-headed man. He squatted by the fire with his arms folded and surveyed the four prisoners. Frank and Joe had been dragged back to the cave with the others and were now bound and helpless while the gangsters confronted them. "Who are these two?" asked the man called Pete, indicating the Hardy Boys. Red shook his head. "We've seen 'em before. They were in the boat the day we were looking for these two birds over here," he remarked, gesturing towards Chet and Biff. "What's your names?" demanded Pete gruffly. The Hardy Boys glanced at one another. Their captors were not yet aware of their identity, and they did not know whether to admit it or not. Frank resolved on silence as the best course. "Find out," he retorted. An ugly look crept into Red's face. "Is that so?" he snarled. "Won't talk, eh? I'll soon make you talk." He leaned forward and wrenched open Frank's coat. Frank's wrists were handcuffed, and he was helpless to resist. Red pulled him roughly to one side and groped in the inner pocket of his coat. There was a rustle of papers, and he withdrew 2 or 3 letters. Frank bit his lip in exasperation. He had forgotten about the letters, and he knew that any hope of concealing his identity was now lost. The red-headed man brought the letters over to the fire and squinted at the addresses. His eyes opened wide. His jaw dropped. "Frank Hardy," he gasped. "What?" demanded one of the other men. "All these letters are addressed to Frank Hardy," declared the astonished gangster. "What do you know about that?" With a sudden movement, Pete grasped Joe by the collar and held him, while he turned his pockets inside out. Finally, with an air of triumph, he produced Joe's membership card in Bayport Athletic Association, on which his name was written in full. "Joe Hardy," he read. "Why, these are the real Hardy Boys." The gangsters looked at one another with crestfallen expressions, but their momentary astonishment at realization of their mistake was quickly changed to rejoicing. "I told you we weren't the Hardy Boys," put in Chet. "I told you all along that you were making a mistake." "Shut up," ordered Red. "Yes, men, we have made a mistake, all right. We didn't have the Hardy Boys after all, but now we've got 'em. I'll say this is a piece of luck. We've got the whole caboodle now." Meanwhile, one of the men had been going more thoroughly through the boys' pockets. Now he grunted. "Armed. Would you believe it? Brats like these." "Take the guns away," came the order from Red. "What'll we do with the others?" demanded one of the gangsters. "With the 2 we caught in the first place? We'll hang right on to 'em. We'll hold the Hardy Boys for ransom the way we intended to, and we'll make some money out of the other 2 as well. You 2 boys," he said, turning to Chet and Biff, "have your people got money?" "Find out," snapped Chet, following Frank's example. "We'll find out, all right," rasped Pete. "We'll find out. And if they haven't got money, that'll be all the worse for the pack of you." He chuckled suddenly. "We'll make a real haul out of these men. 4 ransoms. Yes, and now that we have the real Hardy Boys, we'll give Fenton Hardy a few anxious minutes," laughed another of the men from a dark corner of the cave. "Where is our father?" asked Frank. Red scratched his chin meditatively. "You getting curious, eh? Want to know where your father is? I'll tell you. He's in a safe place, where he can't get out of. Our men out in West got him." "What are they going to do with him?" "Ha!" said Red, with an air of mystery. "What are they going to do to him? That's the question. One thing is certain. They're going to let him live until we collect ransom from you 2. And after that, it's up to the boss. But I'm thinking he'll never let Fenton Hardy loose again. It's too dangerous. Maybe now, my young friends." "Don't talk too much, Red," warned Pete, stirring the fire. "Put these kids all in the inner cave, and let's go to sleep again." "I guess you're right, Pete," agreed the red-headed man. "It don't pay to let 'em know too much." With that, the Hardy Boys and their 2 chums were bundled into the other cave, where a long chain was passed beneath the links of their handcuffs and passed through a staple embedded in the rock. The chain was fastened with a heavy padlock. Frank's heart sank as he heard the padlock snap, and there seemed to be no hope of escape now. They were securely chained together in the darkness of the inner cave. Their captors left them. "I guess they'll be safe enough in there until morning," grunted Pete, as he departed, last of all. The gangsters returned to their fire, and after a brief discussion in low tones, they wrapped themselves up in blankets once more. The boys talked in whispers. Chet and Biff were anxious to know how the Hardy Boys had followed them to the island, and in a few words Frank told them of the alarm their disappearance had occasioned, and of how they had decided to take a chance on searching Black Snake Island. "If only we could have gotten away," muttered Joe. "We'd have been out toward the mainland in the boat by now." "If even one of us could have got away, he could have gone for help," Frank whispered. "Oh well, here we are, and we have to make the best of it. I'm worried about what they said about Dad. So am I. We've simply got to get out of here. If we can get word to the Chicago police, they may be able to find him before it's too late." The boys were silent. The news that Fenton Hardy had been captured and that he was in the hands of a merciless gang cast a cloud of gloom over them all. They realized only too well their own helplessness in the situation. "I'm going to try to smash the lock on this pair of handcuffs," Joe whispered finally. "It seemed rusty to me when they put them on." "We tried that once," whispered Chet. "It wasn't any use. I may have better luck." "Wait until you're sure the gang are asleep," whispered Biff. "They might hear you." The boys lapsed into silence. The darkness of the cave was impenetrable. Near the entrance they could see a faint glow of pink from the embers of the fire in the outer cavern. But that was all. They could not even see one another. The fact that they were chained together made it impossible for them to rest comfortably. The gangsters had not even provided them with a blanket. "We've been chained in here every night since they caught us," Chet whispered. "We've had to sleep on the bare rocks." Finally, the silence was broken by the sound of steel against rock. Joe was trying to break the lock of his handcuffs. The effort was difficult because his hands were cuffed behind him. But as he said, the cuffs were rusty and very antiquated. Against the hard rock, he could feel them gradually giving way. For more than 10 minutes he battered the lock, the steel digging into his wrists. He worked as quietly as possible, with long intervals between each attempt. For a while he was afraid the effort would be fruitless, as even the rusty steel seemed obdurate. Then suddenly he felt the lock give way. He eased his hands out of the cuffs with a sigh of relief. "I'm free," he whispered to the others. There were suppressed exclamations of delight. "How are you going to get us out?" whispered Frank. "I'll try to find the keys." A low murmur from the other cave arrested his attention. Swiftly he leaned back against the wall. One of the gangsters was awake. The boys listened. They heard a movement in the outer cave, a jingling of keys, and then a heavy footstep. Joe thrust his arms behind his back and feigned slumber. He could hear someone entering their cave. Suddenly a bright light flashed in his face. The man on guard had come to inspect the captives, and he brought with him a flashlight. Joe kept his eyes closed and breathed heavily. He hoped desperately that the man would not inspect their handcuffs. The fellow appeared satisfied, and in a few moments went away. Through narrowed eyes, Joe could see his dark form as he reached the passage between the two caves. He saw the round white circle of light shine for a moment on a small rock shelf in the passageway, and he saw the guard reach up and toss a bundle of keys on the shelf. Then the man went on his way, switching out the light. Joe's heart beat faster. This was luck for which he had not dared hope. He now knew where the keys were kept. Could he but reach them without arousing the guard, their chances of escape were multiplied tenfold. He waited until it seemed that hours had passed. None of the boys dared so much as whisper. The silence was profound. From the outer cave they could hear snores, but whether the guard was asleep or not, they could not tell. Joe realized that they would have to make their attempt before dawn, but he always knew that he could afford to wait because the hours just before the break of day are the hours in which the average person sleeps most soundly, and there was every chance that the guard might be asleep by then as well. At last he decided that it was time to act. He got up quietly, began to make his way across the cave. Inch by inch he crawled across the rocky floor. He scarcely dared breathe for fear of disturbing one of their captors. He was at the passage at last. The fire in the outer cave had died down. There was scarcely a vestige of light. This gave him hope, for it seemed to indicate that the guard had fallen asleep. Otherwise, he would have replenished the fire to protect himself against the night chill. Joe groped for the little rock shelf. At first it eluded him, but at last his hand closed upon the keys. Carefully he raised them, his hand clutching them tightly to prevent a betraying jangle of sound. He turned slowly to make his way back to the others. In silence he reached them and began to grope for the chain that bound them together. He found the chains at last, and then the padlock, and felt in the darkness for the key to fit it. The key at last. It was larger than the others, which he judged were the handcuff keys. The padlock snapped, and he unhooked the chain. "That's that," he whispered quietly. "Now for the handcuffs." One by one the other boys presented their shackled wrists to him in the darkness, and groped for the key that he would set them free. In a tense silence he fumbled with the locks and the handcuffs, but one by one the handcuffs opened. One by one the boys moved quietly aside, rubbing their chafed wrists. At last the task was finished. They were free again, but there still remained the outer cave. And we will continue this book next Friday or Saturday, and thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.